The cold rim of the champagne flute did little to soothe the heat climbing Naomi's neck. Around them, the low thrum of the Shinjuku bar was a symphony of clinking ice, murmured Japanese, and the smooth cadence of a jazz piano. It was a place of curated elegance, of shadows and soft light, but the space between her and her husband, Richard, had become a pocket of raw, ugly noise. "Did you really think that was appropriate?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper that slid under the music. "Chatting up Tanaka-san like you were some market girl haggling over fish." Naomi's fingers tightened on the delicate stem of her glass. "I was discussing the provenance of the Edo period screen he's considering for the auction. It's my job, Richard. I'm an art curator. It's the entire reason we're in Tokyo. Your job is to be my wife," he corrected, his blue eyes cold and flat. "To look decorative and to keep your mouth shut unless I ask you a question. That acquisition is my money, my influence. You are here because I allow you to be." Each word was a small, sharp stone thrown at her composure. She was a tall woman, with proud, broad shoulders and a body that unapologetically took up space in the world, a fact Richard never failed to use as a weapon. He preferred women who were like whispers, who could be folded up and put away. Naomi was a statement, and he was constantly trying to edit her. She stared into her champagne, watching the bubbles rise and die, and tried to breathe. She was 22, married for a year to a man who saw her as an accessory he'd overpaid for, and stranded 6,000 miles from anything that felt like home. That was when she made the mistake of looking up. Her gaze drifted past Richard's sneering face, across the expensive, dimly lit room, and snagged on something. Not a person, not at first, just a detail. In a secluded booth, a man sat perfectly still. All she could see clearly were his hands, resting on the polished dark wood of the table. They were long-fingered and immaculate, one lying flat, the other curled loosely around a glass of amber liquid. From beneath the starched white cuff of his bespoke suit, a sliver of darkness peeked out. It wasn't a shadow. It was ink. An intricate, breathtaking pattern of what looked like a dragon's scales, coiling around his wrist. The detail was so fine, so precise, it seemed less like a tattoo and more like a second skin. He moved then, a slight turn of his head, and the light caught the severe line of his jaw. He was Japanese, his features sharp and impassive, carved from something harder than stone. He was listening to the man beside him, but his eyes, dark and heavy-lidded, were scanning the room with a predator's lazy assessment. He looked like he owned the silence between the notes of the piano. "Are you even listening to me?" Richard's voice snapped her attention back. His face was flushed with alcohol and irritation. "I bring you to one of the most exclusive clubs in Tokyo, and you embarrass me." "I didn't embarrass you, Richard." Her voice was low, tight with the effort of holding herself together. "You did," he insisted, leaning closer. The smell of expensive whiskey was cloying. "You always do. Too loud. Too much." He gestured vaguely at her body, a flick of his wrist that was more insulting than any word. "I told you to wear the black dress." The slimming 1 inch, a wave of humiliation, hot and sickening, washed over her. She stood up. "I need some air." His hand shot out, grabbing her arm. His fingers dug into her flesh, a cruel, proprietary grip. "You will sit down. We are not leaving until I am ready to leave." "Let go of me, Richard." The plea was quiet, but it was the last thread of her control. He saw the defiance in her eyes, and something inside him curdled. For a moment, she thought he would just tighten his grip, drag her back into her seat. Instead, his hand released her arm only to swing through the air. The sound was shockingly loud, a sharp, flat crack that severed the music and the murmurs. For a heartbeat, the entire bar went silent. The slap wasn't just a physical blow, it was a violation of the room's unwritten rules. This was a place of quiet power and hidden transactions, not cheap, public violence. The sting on her cheek bloomed into a painful, burning heat. A single, choked cry of shock and pain escaped her lips before she could stop it. And in that sudden, absolute silence, everything changed. From the corner booth, there was a scrape of a chair, a quiet word spoken in Japanese. The man with the ink-stained wrists was on his feet. He moved with an unnatural grace, not hurried, but with a lethal deliberation that made the air around him seem to grow colder and thicker. Two other men, broad-shouldered and dressed in identical dark suits, rose with him, flanking him like pillars. Richard, still puffed up with his petty victory, turned to face them. He seemed to shrink a little. "This is a private matter," he slurred, attempting an arrogant dismissal. The man stopped a few feet away. He didn't look at Richard. His gaze was fixed on Naomi, on the bright red mark blossoming on her brown skin. His eyes, which had seemed empty and distant before, were now intensely focused. They were the color of dark, polished obsidian, and they missed nothing. "Apologize to her," he said. His English was perfect, unaccented, and utterly devoid of emotion.
"It was not a request."
Richard laughed, a short, incredulous bark. "I don't know who you think you are, but you need to mind your own business. This is my wife." The man's expression did not change, but a stillness fell over him that was more menacing than any overt threat. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod to the men behind him. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency. One stepped behind Richard, grabbing him by the collar and the belt. The other delivered a single, precise blow to his stomach that drove the air from his lungs in a silent gasp. There was no struggle. Richard was simply lifted, his feet dragging for a moment, and then he was gone, escorted out a side door into the Tokyo night. The entire event took less than 5 seconds. The bar remained frozen. The jazz pianist had his hands hovering over the keys, his face a mask of polite terror. The man now stood before Naomi. He was taller than he had seemed sitting down, his suit tailored to a millimeter of perfection over a lean, powerful frame. The scent of his cologne drifted to her, something clean and sharp, like cedar and cold night air. He tilted his head, his gaze still on her cheek. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice the same low, controlled monotone. She could only shake her head, her throat tight with unshed tears. She was trembling, a deep, internal shudder she couldn't control. He looked at the wedding band on her left hand, a diamond Richard had chosen to show off his wealth. "He is your husband." The words caught in her throat. She managed a single, jerky nod. To deny it felt like a lie too vast to tell. Even now. The man's dark eyes held hers. For a long moment, he was silent, as if processing a complex equation. He looked at the door through which Richard had vanished, then back at her. A decision was made, absolute and final. The air in the room seemed to crystallize around his next words. "He is not," the man said, the statement as calm and certain as a law of nature. He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His gaze was unwavering, an act of possession. "I will be." The words didn't land like a proposal or a promise. They landed like a verdict. Naomi was no longer in her life. She was in his. The penthouse was a palace of glass and steel suspended over the glittering sprawl of Tokyo. It was breathtaking, a panorama of a million blinking lights, but to Naomi, it was a cage. A beautiful, silent, terrifyingly luxurious cage. Her clothes had been brought from the hotel, folded in drawers of dark, fragrant wood. Her passport and phone were gone. For 2 days, she existed in a state of suspended shock. She paced the length of the vast living room, from the floor-to-ceiling windows to the minimalist black leather sofas, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. She was watched, always. Not overtly, but she felt the presence of the silent men in dark suits who stood by the elevators, the discreet maid who brought her meals on a lacquered tray and bowed without meeting her eyes. Her captor, the man from the bar, was an enigma. Takahashi Ryo. She had learned his name from one of the guards, a slip of the tongue. He was there, and not there. He would appear in the evenings, his presence immediately lowering the temperature of the room. He would sit across from her at the long dining table, eating his meal with the same deliberate precision with which he did everything else. He did not speak to her. He simply watched her, his obsidian eyes taking in her every move. On the third day, she found her voice. He was in his study, a room lined with books from floor to ceiling, when she walked in without knocking. He looked up from a document, his face impassive. "I want to go home," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You have no right to keep me here. Your husband's associates disagree," Ryu stated, setting his pen down with surgical neatness. Humiliating a man like Richard Albright in a place like that has consequences. He is a man who trades in influence and ego. You became a liability the moment he struck you. To them, you are now a loose end. "So you're protecting me?" she asked, a bitter laugh escaping her. "By locking me up? You are safer here than anywhere else in the city," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Your old life is a ghost. It is better you let it fade," he gestured to a chair.
Seat.
She remained standing. "I am not one of your possessions, Mr. Takahashi." A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, or surprise, crossed his features for a bare second. "No," he agreed. "You are not. You are a complication, one I have chosen to manage." The days bled into a week. Naomi learned to navigate the silent currents of the penthouse. She learned that Ryo was not merely a wealthy businessman. He was the Oyabun, the head of the Takahashigumi, one of the most powerful Yakuza clans in Tokyo. His empire was built on a foundation of ritual, loyalty, and violence that was as intricate and unyielding as the tattoos that covered his body, which she sometimes glimpsed at his collar or wrist. He was a king in a kingdom of shadows. And she began to see him as more than just a captor. He was a man of intense, almost monastic discipline. He rose before the sun, spent an hour in the private dojo at the end of the hall, and worked with a focus that was absolute. He began to see her, too. He noticed she barely ate the food brought to her. The next day, a spread of fresh fruit, yogurt, and warm bread appeared for breakfast instead of the traditional Japanese fare. He noticed she spent hours staring out the window. A collection of English-language art history books appeared on the coffee table, thick volumes on everything from ukiyo-e prints to contemporary sculpture. They were small things, almost undeniable, but they were gestures of observation, of attention. One night, unable to sleep, she wandered through the silent apartment. A light was on in his study. She hesitated at the door, then pushed it open a crack. He was not working. He was standing by the window, his back to her, looking down at the city. In his hand, he held a small, framed photograph. He was so absorbed, he didn't hear her. She saw the picture's reflection in the glass. It was an old, slightly faded photo of a young woman, barely out of her teens, with Ryo's same dark eyes but a wild, defiant smile that he lacked. His thumb stroked the edge of the frame, a gesture of such profound, quiet grief that it made Naomi's breath catch in her throat. A discreet knock came from the main door of the study. One of his lieutenants entered, bowing low. "Ryo-sama," the man said softly. "Forgive the intrusion. I only wished to acknowledge the day." "For Akemi-san." Ryo didn't turn. "There is nothing to acknowledge," he said, his voice flat and brittle. "Only a debt that can never be repaid." The lieutenant bowed again and retreated, leaving a silence thick with unspoken history. Akemi, his sister. The woman he had failed. That was his wound, the one vulnerability he carried beneath the layers of silk, steel, and ink. He had lost a woman he was meant to protect, and now he was overcompensating with Naomi. She wasn't just a complication. She was a ghost he was trying to save. The outside world did not remain quiet. The allies of Richard Albright were not men who forgave insults. A week after Naomi's abduction, a sleek black car parked across the street from the building exploded in the dead of night, a violent, fiery message. The penthouse was put on lockdown. Red lights flashed silently in the hallways, and steel shutters descended over the great glass windows, plunging the apartment into a dim, artificial twilight. In the controlled chaos, as guards moved with quiet urgency, Naomi saw her chance. A younger guard, his face pale with fear, caught her eye. He looked away, then back, and gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod toward a service corridor she'd never noticed before. He thought he was helping her, a misguided act of chivalry. He didn't understand that letting her go was a death sentence. But in that moment, all Naomi could see was an open door. Freedom. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. She could run. She could disappear into the Tokyo night, find an embassy, get home. She slipped into the corridor, her stockinged feet making no sound. The air was cool, smelling of ozone and cleaning fluid. The exit was a heavy steel door at the far end. She was halfway there when the sound of a silenced gunshot echoed from the direction of Ryu's study. A soft thump, followed by the sound of shattering glass. She froze. Her mind screamed at her to keep going. Run. This is not your world. This is not your fight. But the image of his face, haunted and stark as he looked at that photograph, flashed in her mind. A debt that can never be repaid. He had saved her from Richard, not for her sake, but for his own. Still, he had saved her. And she had seen the man beneath the monster, if only for a second. She could not leave him to his ghosts. Turning her back on the exit, she ran back the way she came. She burst into the study to a scene of lethal stillness. A man in black tactical gear lay dead on the floor near the shattered window, a small, dark hole in his temple. Ryu stood over him, a pistol in his hand, his breathing harsh. Blood dripped from a long, ragged gash on his left forearm, staining the white cuff of his shirt a brilliant, shocking crimson. His men were already swarming the room, securing the perimeter, their movements a blur of deadly competence. Ryu looked up and saw her. His eyes widened in genuine surprise. "You could have left," he said, his voice rough with exertion. Naomi didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the blood welling from his arm. The professional curator in her, the one who knew how to handle delicate, priceless things, was gone. In her place was someone else, someone forged in the last 10 days of fear and observation. She scanned the room, spotted a decorative wooden box on a shelf, and knew it held a first aid kit. She retrieved it, her hands steady. She walked directly to him, ignoring the dead man on the floor and the armed guards surrounding them. She took his uninjured hand and led him to a chair, pushing him down into it with a gentle but firm pressure. He let her, his body suddenly compliant, his eyes never leaving her face. She opened the kit, her movements efficient. As she knelt before him and began to clean the wound with an antiseptic wipe, the world narrowed to the space between them. The sharp, sterile smell of the wipe, the warmth of his skin, the surprising texture of the ink beneath her fingers. He flinched as she cleaned the gash, a small, involuntary hiss of pain. Their eyes met. In the charged silence, surrounded by death and the quiet hum of his empire, something shifted. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, and she was touching him as if she had every right in the world. And he was letting her. The failed assassination attempt changed the atmosphere in the penthouse. The invisible walls of Naomi's cage seemed to recede. Ryu no longer treated her as a fragile object to be guarded, but as a piece on the board he had not yet figured out how to play. He returned her phone, placing it on the table beside her breakfast tray. "Your old contacts have been erased," he said, his tone flat. Making new ones would be unwise. For them, the threat was unspoken but absolute. Her old life was not just gone, it was a minefield he had cordoned off. He started speaking to her more, not in long conversations, but in brief, observational statements. He would ask her opinion on a piece of art he was considering acquiring, not for a gallery but for his own collection. He'd watch her as she explained the subtle genius of a brushstroke, the history embedded in a ceramic glaze. He was studying her, learning the architecture of her mind. This new, strange sort of freedom was more unsettling than her captivity. It gave her the space to explore. One afternoon, driven by a restless curiosity, she found herself back in his study. He was gone, meeting with his lieutenants in a downtown office. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, a collection that spanned from Sun Tzu to Renaissance poetry. On a low shelf, Behind a row of leather-bound classics, her fingers brushed against a section of the wall that felt different. It was a panel, seamless and perfectly fitted. With a soft click, it opened, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were not jewels or weapons but files. Manila folders, neatly labeled in Japanese. One, however, was in English. Albright, Richard. M&A. Her blood ran cold. She pulled it out. It was a comprehensive dossier, detailing every dirty deal, every illicit partnership, every vulnerability Richard Albright possessed. And the date on the earliest entry was 3 months before she had ever set foot in that Shinjuku bar. Ryo hadn't just stumbled upon her. He had been hunting Richard's network for months. The bar, the confrontation, the slap, it had all been an unexpected opportunity, a moment of chaos he had seized with breathtaking opportunism. She was not the reason for the war. She was simply collateral, a prize of battle he had claimed. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. The rescue, the protection, it was all built on a foundation of cold, calculated strategy. It should have sent her running for the phantom exit again. It should have made her hate him. But as she stood there, the file in her hands, all she felt was a dizzying, terrifying sense of clarity. The world she had known was a lie. This world, for all its brutality, was honest. Her complicity came sooner than she expected. Richard's allies, a shadowy consortium of international criminals, were growing impatient. Unable to breach Rhea's fortress, they attacked the one thing of hers they could still reach, her past. News articles began to appear on obscure financial blogs, then more mainstream outlets. Promising art curator implicated in forgery scandal. They used Richard's connections at the gallery, bribed officials, and fabricated evidence to frame her for attempting to sell a forged artifact. They were systematically destroying her name, her career, her very identity. Ryo brought the tablet to her, displaying an article from a New York paper. Her face, a professional headshot taken in happier times, stared back at her. "They are trying to draw you out," he said. "To make you a liability he cannot afford to keep." "Can you fix this?" she asked, her voice hollow. "I can erase it," he replied. "But everything in this world has a price." He laid out a series of surveillance photographs on the table. They were grainy images of men in expensive suits, taken outside restaurants, in airport lounges. Richard Albright was a small fish. His primary financial partner is the one waging this war. He is in one of these pictures. I need you to identify him. Naomi stared at the faces. And then she saw him, a man with silver hair and a kind smile, standing next to Richard at her wedding a year ago. He had given them a toast. He had shaken her hand, his palm dry and cool. Naming him would be signing his death warrant. She looked from the photograph to the tablet, at her own face smeared with lies. She thought of Richard's hand on her arm, the crack of the slap, the endless quiet humiliations. She thought of her career, her passion, turned to ash by men who saw her as nothing. Slowly, her finger rose. She pressed the tip to the glass, directly over the smiling, silver-haired man's face. "That one," she said. Her voice did not tremble. A line had been crossed, and she did not look back. That night, the guilt found her. She stood on the balcony, the wind cold against her skin, and stared at the endless city lights. She had just condemned a man to death, a man she had shared champagne with. "I never thought I could be a person who could do that," she whispered to the darkness. She didn't hear Ryu approach, but suddenly he was there, standing a few feet away, a dark silhouette against the glittering skyline. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a tangible weight. "You did what was necessary to survive," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That is the only law in this world." She turned to face him, anger and a strange, desperate need warring inside her. "Is that what this is? Survival?" Her voice was raw. "I had a chance to leave. I ran toward the gunfire. I came back here. That wasn't survival." The words hung between them, a confession she hadn't intended to make. It was the truth, stark and dangerous. She wasn't just surviving. She was choosing. He looked at her, his face half in shadow, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it over the wind. I know. It was not an apology or a declaration. It was an admission. A shared truth. He knew she had chosen to stay. And he had chosen to let her. Their fragile truce was shattered 2 days later. A package arrived, delivered by a courier who was intercepted and searched 3 times before he reached the lobby. It was a simple, elegant box tied with a silk ribbon. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a single flower, a dead orchid. It was a Habenaria radiata, the white egret flower, a rare and delicate orchid native to Japan. It was the exact varietal she had been trying to acquire for the gallery, the subject of the very conversation that had led to Richard striking her. The message was brutally clear. We know who you are. We know what you were. We know what you love. And we can take it all away. The war was no longer about Ryu's empire. The enemy had found a new target. Her. The dead orchid was not just a threat. It was a mistake. It was a clue. Ryu's vast intelligence network, a web of whispers and digital ghosts, traced the flower's unique horticultural signature to a single, private greenhouse in the hills outside Kyoto. It was a known meeting place for the rival clan, a place of supposed neutrality. They were daring him to come. It was a trap. I will handle this, Ryu said, his voice clipped with a cold fury she had never seen directed at anyone but his enemies. No, Naomi said, standing before him in the study, the dead flower on the table between them. They used my work, my life, to make this threat. They made this personal for me. This is my fight, too. You are not a soldier, he stated, his eyes hard. You will stay here, where you are safe. Your safety hasn't worked out so well so far, she shot back, her fear eclipsed by a sudden, burning anger. They got to me, Ryo. They reached inside this fortress and left a piece of my old life on your table to die. I am not an asset in this fight. That greenhouse is owned by a man named Kenjiro. He's a recluse. The entire system is automated, but he has a panic room in the sublevel, reinforced with titanium. The schematics are probably online if you look up the contractor. He's paranoid about earthquakes. That's where your target will be hiding when the fighting starts. Am I an asset now? He stared at her, his composure cracking for the first time. He had seen her as a curator, a victim, a complication. He had never seen her as a strategist. You will go, he said finally, his voice tight. But you will be in the command vehicle 2 kilometers away. You will guide. You will not engage. That is my final word. The command vehicle was a black van filled with a bank of monitors, a rolling nerve center. Naomi sat before the screens, a headset over her ears, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She watched the heat signatures of Ryu's men move like silent ghosts through the lush, humid corridors of the greenhouse. Ryo was a black-clad wraith, moving with lethal economy. Then it went wrong. The rival boss, the silver-haired man from the photograph, wasn't in the panic room. The intelligence was bad. A feed from a camera in the main conservatory flickered, showing Ryo and 2 of his men pinned down behind a massive stone lantern, gunfire erupting from the canopy above. A trap within a trap. We have to get him out of there, one of the technicians in the van yelled. The guards with her moved to block the door. Oyabun's orders. You stay here. Naomi's eyes scanned the blueprints she had pulled up on a secondary screen. Her mind, trained to see patterns and connections in art, saw something else now. A schematic for the greenhouse's environmental systems. The section where Ryo was trapped was adjacent to a small, unassuming room labeled pesticide and chemical storage. Volatile compounds, kept under pressure. Patch me through to his team's comms, she ordered the technician.
Now.
Her voice was calm, clear, and absolute. The technician, startled by her tone of command, obeyed. Team 3, she said into the microphone, her voice steady. 20 meters to your east is a chemical storage closet. The door is steel, but the wall behind it is drywall. Breach the wall. There are 3 canisters of perethrin concentrate inside.
Puncture them.
The system will register it as a catastrophic toxic leak. That will trigger a full lockdown, the team leader's voice crackled back. It will vent the entire conservatory. Exactly, Naomi said. It will also deploy a chemical suppression fog. Zero visibility. Get it done. She watched the heat signatures converge on the closet. A moment later, the camera feeds in the conservatory whited out as a thick, white fog billowed from the vents. Emergency alarms blared. Sprinklers kicked on, raining down water. Chaos. Through the headset, she heard shouting, confusion from the enemy. She saw Rio's heat signature move, a swift, dark blur through the manufactured storm. Then a series of precise, silent shots. And then silence. In the aftermath, amidst the dripping water and the cloying, chemical smell, Rio found her by the van. She had disobeyed his orders and stepped outside, unable to breathe in the confined space. He walked toward her, ignoring the flurry of activity as his men secured the area. A fresh cut bled freely from a gash on his cheekbone, but his eyes were fixed on her. He stopped directly in front of her. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the misty, post-battle quiet. He reached up, his fingers gently brushing her cheek, not the one he had just cut, but the other one. The one where Richard's slap had landed, a lifetime ago. The skin was long since healed, but he touched it as if he could still feel the phantom bruise. "In my world," he said, his voice low and raw, stripped of all its usual control, "debts of violence are paid in blood. That is simple. But loyalty," he paused, his thumb stroking her skin. "Loyalty is answered with everything." He held her gaze, and in his dark eyes, she saw the fall of an empire and the rise of something new. "You are mine, Naomi," he said. It was not a claim of ownership like before. It was an acknowledgement, a truth. "Not my prisoner."
Meaning?
The cost was absolute. Richard Albright was a ghost, his name and influence erased from the world. The consortium that had backed him was shattered, its leaders vanished into the shadows from which they came. Naomi's name was cleared, the fabricated scandal retracted with quiet apologies from publications that had been strong-armed into compliance. But her old life was a ruin she could never rebuild. Her family believed she was on an extended sabbatical, her emails brief and her calls infrequent, always from a block number. The price for her safety, for this new, dangerous life, was the complete death of her old one. The story does not end with a declaration of love shouted from a rooftop, or a diamond ring to replace the one she had thrown into the Tokyo Bay. It ends in quiet. Weeks later, she sat curled in a chair in the penthouse, the city a jeweled tapestry below. She was sketching in a notebook, the charcoal smooth and dark under her fingers. It was not a design for a gallery or a plan for an acquisition. It was a face, a landscape from a memory, something just for her. Ryu entered the room, his movements as silent as ever. He did not speak. He simply walked to the small table beside her and set down a cup. The steam rose, carrying the fragrant, earthy scent of genmaicha, the roasted brown rice tea she had come to love. He knew. He had learned the small, quiet details of her, the things she loved when she wasn't fighting for her life. She looked up from her drawing, her charcoal-smudged fingers still. Her eyes met his across the room. There was no fear in her gaze, no hesitation. There was only a profound, unshakable understanding. A choice, made in a moment of gunfire and chaos, now remade every day in the quiet moments in between. Naomi reached for the cup, her fingers wrapping around its warmth. She was not a guest. She was not a prisoner. In this gilded cage at the top of the world, surrounded by a silent, lethal army, she was finally, terrifyingly, home. And for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid.